To prepare your AA for maintenance, you'll need to turn off the power, turn off the supply pressure, and turn off the pump. You'll need to disconnect the hoses, and if you have an adhesive material, you may want to apply a solvent to prevent curing. You'll also need to disconnect the air lines and disconnect the sensor. Then use hex keys to dismount the AA.
Okay, now that we have the dispense chamber off the machine and onto our work surface, I'm going to start by removing fittings. Getting these fittings out allows you to make sure that the passages inside are clean. With the adhesive type materials or RTV, you can get cured up material in the ports and under the valves. A lot of times the fittings will get clogged as well, and you can replace them with new fittings. This fitting's being difficult because it has somewhat dried material on the threads. So, as we did before, you can lubricate the ports with grease or oil or solvent to prevent the material inside from curing up, and then move on to removing the cartridge valves. If you are doing like a grease dispenser, you might not have to take the cartridge valves out if there haven't been any issues with them. But on an RTV or adhesive system, it's always a good idea to remove them. Then you can inspect and just make sure that they're free-flowing. Loosening these up with the adjustable wrench. They also fit a 1-inch open-end wrench. So here I can see that this one has started to get some material dried up around it. It's not too bad with this material, but we will want to keep it protected from drying out, so I'm putting solvent on that on the ports again here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all 3 cartridge valves, give them a quick look, and then set them aside. If you take out your cartridge valves and they are clogged, there are rebuild kits that we offer, and if they're too bad, you may just end up replacing the valve. It's a good idea to have spares on hand. Then you can replace them as needed, and then you'd have the option to rebuild the ones that you've taken out. So again, I'm continuing to put solvent on the ports, on the threads, on the valves to prevent the material inside from setting up or drying out. Once you get the ace valves loose, a lot of times you can rotate the whole thing by hand. May not be the case with adhesive systems, especially versus a grease system, because the threads and the base can get basically stuck in place from the adhesives. The next step here is I'm going to take the flange block off of the dispense chamber. So then almost all of them, there are 4 socket head screws holding it on. Once you get the screws loose, it should pull right off. There are locating dowels in between them, so in some cases it may be a little harder to separate the blocks. So here I'm also checking the screw threads. Some of them, if it was taken apart or put back together on the line or with adhesive, some of the screws have gotten some of that RTV material into them, so I'm just cleaning that off to make the threads easy to use. So on this unit, there are usually on the side facing the chamber is where the rod seals will be. This is a small rod and has very small seals. So I'm taking the seal out, checking the condition of it, and almost always replacing it. Then I'm just going to remove the O-ring that goes between the flange block and the dispense chamber. Pick out any cured material, but you want to be careful not to gouge the aluminum. But I'm just cleaning some of the residue off the end to make sure that the 2 aluminum blocks go back face to face and have a good flat and straight mating when they get bolted together. I'm going to clean out the thread on the material ports. It is best to make sure it's in really good condition before you reassemble. On the flange block that I have here, underneath the rod seal is typically a bushing. Sometimes there are 2 seals, but there's also a bushing in the block. So right now I've taken the metering rod and I'm sliding it through the bushing to make sure that there's no extra resistance. Make sure that by using some solvent, the bushing surface is nice and clean, and then the rod surface can also be clean and be wiped. Make sure that there's no residue there. So we need to make sure that the pocket for the rod seal is cleaned out before putting in the new seal. Then I'll go back to the dispense chamber itself. This has 3 ports for the cartridge valves and 3 ports for the hoses coming in and out for dispense and purge, as well as where the rod enters. I'm going to use a pick and some solvent if needed to clear out the passageway for the rod. As the rod is inserted, you can see it pass through the windows, if you will. You can see it go through each of the portholes where the valves are installed. So debris that's getting pushed in by the rod and kind of getting cleared out will end up in the middle of the block. You can see it traveling as you push the rod in. So that allows you to pick the debris out from these top holes. You want to make sure to be careful with the rod, not to push it in at an angle or score the edges of it at all. Any material that you leave in there, if it should come loose, then you may have chunks that end up going downstream and clogging your end of arm tooling or your dispense valves. So now I've picked out most of the chunks and I'm taking solvent and a cotton swab to lubricate the threads or to loosen up a little bit more of the debris that's in there. Any tools that you use, if you use a steel pick, for instance, you can end up scratching if you have the aluminum dispense chamber, which is typical. So you want to use soft tools if you can. Sometimes swabs are good, or brass or plastic picks. On a lot of our dispensers, we have dual seals. The first one is oftentimes a rod wiper or scraper, and you can see when you have the seals in hand, you can see that there is an O-ring, which is called the energizing O-ring in the seal. For this particular machine, there's one rod seal. The orange one that has the O-ring removed, which is considered the rod scraper or rod wiper, would go in second, would be the second one installed. So it would be closest to the dispense chamber. I'm also installing the mating O-ring between the 2 blocks. If you have a little bit of grease to put on O-rings, it helps them stay in the groove. So I'm going to add some solvent here into the pockets just to eliminate air and to allow the seals to compress and seat properly. Once you have both blocks cleaned up and the seals are reinstalled, you can go ahead and bolt them together. So now I have the blocks together, the rod seal is in place. I have a little bit of solvent inside the chamber near the rod seals. And add a bit here to make sure the rod is well lubricated when it goes in. I've got all the mating surfaces clean. I've got the cartridge valves ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten the first one while I have plenty of access for the wrench. And again, I'm lubricating the threads and the seals before inserting the valve. And at this point, that's the last one is the most difficult, or if you're close to a valve that you can't make a full rotation. So I'm just working it back and forth and doing part of a rotation on the hex beneath. And I'm able to use the air cylinder to turn it back and forth as I thread the hex in at the bottom. And I'll go ahead and tighten up the last cartridge valve. So the orientation of the cartridge valves doesn't matter, but these ones, they're far enough apart that the vent holes on the side of the valve have plenty of room to breathe. Now I'm going to clean out some of the fittings. So now I'm looking at these 2 fittings. First, I want to make sure the threads are clean and the mounting surfaces are clean. There's an O-ring on these. They're an SAE O-ring boss fitting, and that O-ring has to go down into the angled hole to form the seal. So I need to make sure that that O-ring is in good condition and didn't get it wasn't damaged by getting pinched or bound as the fitting is installed. And I've got the chamber rebuilt, all the pieces back together. ready to take it back to the machine and put it back onto the AA dispenser. If you have any other questions about our AAs, maintenance, rework, repairs, feel free to give us a call.